I have the distinct privilege to introduce to you probably the greatest bishop I ever worked for. He was the bishop of Washington when I got there, and he retired before I left. But it was truly one of the greatest men I've ever met, and one of the best drummers from the Chane gang, his band. But he's an awesome individual and a great bishop, and on the forefront of social justice issues and on the forefront of what's going on in the Middle East. And I am proud and distinctly honored to be able to welcome the Right Reverend John Chane.
I always follow you. Duke was one of those guys at Washington National Cathedral who literally made liturgy happen. David Deutsch is here too. David, are you sleeping? Oh, my eyesight is failing at my age. David too was a verger, and maybe still is. Washington National. Vergers made liturgy happen. And without vergers, it doesn't matter whether it's Washington National Cathedral, St. Paul's Cathedral here in San Diego, your parish or your cathedral or wherever you serve. Without a verger, there's a big part of liturgical life and process that's missing. So it's great to be here with you this morning, and hopefully you will continue to work because it is extremely important as one who lives by it every day. The topic for discussion is about peacemaking, and I could bore you to death. And I don't want to do that. Let me just give you a little bit of background. I'm a kid from Massachusetts who barely graduated from high school, was a pretty good football player, and so that's how I kind of moved through the academic system. I also was a musician at another side of my life that we will not talk about today. It was very much a fun experience traveling all over the place. Speak into the mic. Can I pick this mic up?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, now I can spend some time. Thank you. Anyway, I wanted to tell you I'm from a different time, as you can tell, and a different generation. As a young person, I grew up in the Episcopal Church in Winchester, Massachusetts. When I went to college for a couple of years before I went on the road as a musician. I never went to church after I left Winchester. I was drawn back into the church, however, after I got married by working with the Episcopal Church in Boston's Roxbury in the South End. And it was those years, several years, where we were doing stuff in parts of the city that had been burned out because of the riots. My bishop was John Melville Burgess, who was a great bishop, and who said, the church needs people who know the street. You know the street. You should go to seminary. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. That's not a good idea. He said, we'll figure it out. I remember going to Washington, D.C. when I was in seminary, my junior year, first year. I did not go with the intention of being ordained. I had a lot of questions, and I happened to have a bishop who said, if you have questions, maybe there are answers there in New Haven at seminary. But I remember going to an anti-war demonstration in Washington, D.C., can't even remember the year, probably 69, 70, I can't remember. Anyway, it was a really tough time for this country. And I went to an Episcopal church, wandered off through D.C. and found this Episcopal church, and it was located in the bowels of that city, part of the city which had been torn up by the riots. And as I walked up the sidewalk to go into the church, there were two people at the front door. One was obviously somebody who had just come off the streets, having had a couple of pops. The other was a person who was really not, I guess you could say, wrapped too tightly together. But they were the welcoming people at that church who invited me in. And the rector had vestments that looked like they were of that time, right out of the 60s. Really wild vestments. The music was unbelievable. The people were great. There was a big luncheon after the service where everybody was invited. And what they did was they were embracing this huge part of the city that had been left barren by the riots. And I thought, that's really what the church ought to be doing. John Hines, who was from Texas, was the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church at that time. John and I became very good friends over the years, and I invited him to come to Erie, Pennsylvania when I was the canon of the cathedral there. And he was very elderly, but he was unbelievably eloquent. And he was calling the church to address some of the conflicts both in our own country, but beginning to look at the conflicts that were emerging in other parts of the world. And so if it was John Hines, John Melville Burgess, two great men in the church, and also Bishop Barbara Harris, who was a part of our journey. Barbara saved my day when I was a priest and canon in Erie, Pennsylvania, when I brought presentment charges against the clergy of the Standing Committee for refusing to abide by the canons of the Episcopal Church that allowed for women to be ordained to the priesthood. And so Barbara was a part of my life. She was then the chair of the Witness magazine, and she sent me a couple $100 if I would write a story about what was going on before I got defrocked, because the bishop said, your time is limited here. But she became part of my staff in Washington. So what we were talking about was internal conflicts in the United States. But when I got to Washington, I had not a clue about what I was supposed to do. I don't know if anybody does if they're elected as a bishop. I mean, I didn't. I had a meeting with Frank Griswold, and Frank said to me, we need to have this talk because you need to understand what you're supposed to do here in Washington. And you need to know that the Episcopal Church has an office for government affairs over the hill. Your job is going to be to run this diocese as best you can. It is to work with our government office on global and internal issues based on resolutions passed by General Convention, and also to address some of the issues that are really conflicting the country and the world. There's a job description for a diocese that we had 102 congregations then, and we had 3 parochial high schools and a bunch of really neat schools in some of our parishes, and then 3 schools in the cathedral close. So it's trying to manage all of that stuff, which I didn't do a very good job of, quite frankly. I had a great staff. I brought people in from wherever, because I thought I knew what my limits were, and I think there were a lot of them. So what happened was I began to be invited to come to meetings on the Hill with Donald Rumsfeld, who was over at the Pentagon with Donald Rumsfeld, who was our Secretary of Defense, to the White House to meet with President Bush's staff, to go to the Israeli embassy to address the issues that were afflicting in a negative way Palestinians, and also what was going on in Gaza at that time. So all of these things are kind of swirling around for somebody who had no clue about what to do. And then, of course, there were other issues that surfaced. What was going on in Africa? There was the impact of the position of the Episcopal Church on human sexuality that was driving a big divide, not only in the Episcopal Church here in the United States, but elsewhere. So we had to deal with that. And there were 4 congregations in the diocese that were going to leave the diocese as soon as I got there. So it was, all of this stuff is swirling around in a big pot. And if you all don't believe in the power of the Holy Spirit, then your journey might be a little tougher than you think it is right now. It was the gift of the Spirit that brought great people to work with me. It was the gift of the Spirit to help me work in a very complex environment. It was the gift of the Spirit that gave me the opportunity to travel pretty much all over the world on behalf of the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion. And to be able to begin to address and work with the government, our own government, which was sometimes a hard nut to crack. But when I think back in my days in Washington, the president that I had the most fun with, if you can believe it, my liberal friends were really shocked, was George Bush. Because he was really focused on Africa at that time. We were, as an Episcopal Church, focused on Africa at that time. There was the issue of the war. That's how I met Donald Rumsfeld. And that's when I went to London and I met with Tony Blair and with some other clerics from around the community. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is the Episcopal Church in my generation was read the gospel and then do it. It's all about relationships. It's all about engagement. It's about being in places where nobody else wants to be. It's about doing the things that will always receive criticism because other people might say it's not the right thing to do or you're not doing it right. I was drawn to the Episcopal Church because we had, at that time, in my generation, a presiding bishop who said, go and be sent forth into the world to make a difference. And that's the challenge that came to me by a fluke of the Holy Spirit's decision-making, to become the Bishop of Washington. And I served there from 2002 until I officially retired, according to the Church Pension Fund, in 2012. I could tell you stories that would curl your hair. I've been to Iran 7 times. I've met with President Khatami, I don't know how many times. Ahmadinejad, who told me he could disappear magically and then reappear in another location without my knowing it. Whatever. But I've been there for 7 times, seven occasions. Been to South Africa, worked with Desmond Tutu and John Nkulu Ntagane. Worked with Trinity Wall Street just before the Lambeth conference that I attended, trying to keep the Episcopal Church together and our African partners together, even in disagreement. So it's peacemaking in terms of where the church was with its struggles. They're not over, they always will be there. But peacemaking within the life of the communion, if it was possible, and then peacekeeping in the life of the nation, if it was possible, and then peacekeeping in the global community, which was where we were headed following 9/11. So I'd rather keep it open and have you ask me questions which I may not be able to answer. Or if you're interested in a particular area of work, I was thinking about this today and I could just, the stories of some I can't tell, some I can tell. But it's an amazing place, I think, for the Episcopal Church to be at the table with the President of the United States and to be able to debate with that person where your church is on this issue based on the decisions of General Convention, and to remind that person, that president, that that's who we are and that's where we stand, and that's the message that I am offering to present to you, Mr. President, this morning. I'll always want to receive. So I would really like to have some questions if that's something that you would like to do. If not, I will bore you with stories.
Hi there, I'm Michael Seward from St. Mark's Cathedral in Seattle.
Great cathedral.
Yeah. There's 4 of us here. Anyway, I don't know if you had attended in 2014 when I was in the Diocese of Kentucky. I attended a conference in Oklahoma City, Reclaiming the Gospel of Peace, and Jeffrey Shorey was there, Justin Welby was there, a lot of amazing speakers. It was one of the best conferences I've ever attended. I attended on behalf of our Diocesan Committee on Peace and Justice, and a lot of really good work came from that, but I haven't seen another iteration of that sort of thing since then, and I'm wondering if you are aware if the Episcopal Church has plans to do something like that again. It was such an enriching time.
Not aware of it, but it's an issue that has surfaced in my life and my heart, because we're not there right now, for whatever reason. And that's hard for me, coming from what I interpreted the gospel to be about. I'm reminded, I had a luncheon right here in San Diego when somebody nominated me. Nobody ever told me who nominated me to run in that election process for the Diocese of Washington, and the bishop, presiding bishop at the time, Frank, was it Frank? Yeah, it was Frank. And he came to town and said, understand you're being considered as a nominee for Bishop of DC. And I said, I don't want to do that. I'm in a cathedral that's alive. This cathedral is just exciting. And it still is. It still is. I don't want to do that. And he said, let's have lunch. We talk about it. And then he said, when you were ordained, what were you ordained to do? I said, I don't know. He said, you were ordained to serve the whole church, not this cathedral, or not this city, but the whole church. And if you don't stay in this election, I will be very disappointed in you. And I said, I better go home and talk to my wife. I told her I was pulling out later today. But that was a reminder that the whole church is the whole church. It's rough side, it's smooth side, the sides are somewhere in between. And I wish we did have an opportunity to gather people together, because I can see change when we do that. And I've lived it. And I'd love to write about it, but there's no time because we're still messing around with other stuff. But your cathedral's there. Has got any more questions? Coffee, anybody?
Thank you. I'm Diane Carlisle, also from Seattle, but not from the cathedral, from Epiphany. And I'm wondering about your work in the Middle East and where you see things going. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the Middle East and the Israel-Palestine conflicts that are going on.
Yeah. There are, it's not just Palestine, it's the Levant with Iraq and Iran. I mean, you just run the gamut. But going back to the Middle East and speaking directly about the situation with the Palestinians, and especially what's gone on and continues to go on in Gaza, we were able to work out an arrangement with the Israeli embassy. One of the things I did when I went to Washington was to, first of all, go up on Capitol Hill on behalf of the Episcopal Church and meet a lot of people who serve the government and this country to say, I represent the Episcopal Church and I'm going to be here, I will be attending hearings, and you will probably see more of me. How can I help you if there's a way that I can help you? But I met with Michael Orenz. Michael Orenz was the ambassador of Israel to the United States when I was in Washington. We had a problem. The problem was Suhail Gilani, who some of you may know, who was then, he became the Premier of the Middle East, but he was then the Bishop of Jerusalem. Archbishop of Jerusalem. I was in a meeting in the House of Bishops, and I got this message on my cell phone saying, I am going to be thrown out of Jerusalem, and will have to leave Palestine because the Israeli government said I was involved in selling land to a Palestinian, which I am not authorized to do. He said, it's all trumped up, and I don't know where it's going, but I think it's because the Israelis do not like me here in Jerusalem. And so I went to Michael Orens and I said, this is crazy stuff. Show me the money, show me the information that you have that this bishop has done something wrong. He said, I can't do that right now. It's still pending, you know what I mean? It's a legal issue. So some of you may know, or may have known, John Peterson, Canon John Peterson. You remember John Peterson, Secretary General of the Anglican Communion. And when he retired, I brought him to Washington too, to work with me at the Center for Global, it was a Global Center for Reconciliation. And we flew to Jerusalem, met with the Interior Minister, met with our representatives of our government, and then went down to Tel Aviv and met with a lawyer to begin to deal with the issue of Suhail and his family being thrown out of the country. So it really was pretty intense. He had something like a week to vacate. He was going to be vacated by the Israeli government. But I had a relationship with Michael Orens. It was a good one. We disagreed, but that's part of life. I said, Michael, this is not going to look good for your government. It really isn't. And unless you have some really good evidence, you better let this thing go. And Michael said, I can see if we can get this done in 5 days. Third day, fourth day, fifth day. The evening of the fifth day, he's in a limousine going to some meeting, and all he said on the phone was, it is done. That's all he said. And when Gaza was attacked back in 2004, maybe 5, which was horrendous, and we have a hospital in Gaza City, the Anglican hospital in Gaza City. A rocket went through the roof of the hospital. So I sent a letter of protest to Condoleezza Rice and to President Bush and asking them for reparations. And the report I got back in the letter from the president was, it was an unfortunate act of war, so there will be no reparations. They'll have to fix it themselves. But there was the war that had broken open was really horrendous. The hospital supplies were running low in Gaza City. They needed a lot of medicine quickly. The whole border was shut off. And if any of you have ever gone into Gaza, it's an interesting trip. However, we were able to, the Israelis in Washington said, you give us a manifest in terms of what kinds of medicines you need for that hospital, and we'll get it to her. We promise you, we will get it to her. So, got a hold of the hospital, they gave us a manifesto, sent it to the Israelis got it over there in 2 days, across the border into Gaza City in a war zone. And if you've never been to Gaza, it looks like what hell must be like. It's just horrible. When I went there with John Peterson and Suhail Gilani to meet with officials in Gaza City, we had to put on hunting vests, nice bright orange ones. And I said, well, why do we have to wear these stupid things? And the Israeli said, because you're going from Israel across this 250-yard stretch of land into Gaza. And unless you're wearing one of these, you're going to get shot. Because we have sharpshooters trained on this area at this border crossing. If you're wearing this, they know not to shoot you. And you'll have to be here for only 14 hours. And if you leave, you will never be able to get back into Israel for at least a month. So with conflicts like that, what you do is you care for the people. And actually, I think everybody has a heart. I think everybody wants to do the right thing. The problem is politics, politics, and politics. It's not easy. It's still an ongoing process. Again, politics is the real unfortunate death trap right now for the Palestinians. And Palestinian leadership, I met with Abbas when he was in Washington and said, you guys got to start leading, for God's sakes. I mean, you're not leading. Have you ever seen their headquarters in Palestine? They're really nice. Surrounded by some pretty shoddy homes, small storefronts, and rough neighborhoods. So Abbas said, it's all about the Israelis. I said, no, it isn't. It's about you, too. It's your leadership. You have got to lead politics. He's still there. I don't know how old he is. He's probably older than I am. Because I thought I was young when I met him. The same is true in Iran. I went to Iran at the request of a former ambassador, Ambassador William Miller. I had a message from the Iranians at the United Nations saying, would the cathedral in Washington be open for President Khatami to speak to the American people? And I wondered what he's going to say. He's a smart guy, nice guy. Everybody thought he was going to make an apology for 1979, when the revolution took over our embassy and imprisoned our people for over a year. So I called up, well, I didn't call up the cathedral. I mean, I'm the bishop. Exactly. But the cathedral was willing to consider it if security issues could be arranged. And so, anyway, what happened was, no, the State Department said he has to stay within a 30-mile radius of the United Nations. He can come and stay at the residence of the ambassador there, but he can't leave that 30-mile zone around the United Nations. So the State Department said he can't come to Washington, D.C. So I had a friend that I used to meet with on the side. These were on immigration issues, which was fascinating. And that's another story. But we would meet, and I would give him resolutions that would be passed and discussed by the Episcopal Church at its General Convention. And he would go back to the Bush administration with this material. That's another story. But I said, can you call the president up and see if he will give permission for Khatami to come to Washington National Cathedral? He said, I don't know, he's back in Texas cutting brush. But he said, I'll call him. About 3 weeks later, I was back in Massachusetts with my wife, my family, on a vacation, visiting my family. And my cell phone rang at a fried clam shack. And it was the White House saying, permission granted. And we will provide security, Secret Service security, also State Department security, not a problem. He came, spoke about Oriental and Occidental theology and the connection between Oriental and Occidental theology from Christian scriptures and Islamic scriptures, differences between Shia and Sunni Christians, and their differences through denominations and interpretations. It was a fascinating lecture. And then as he was leaving, the Secret Service hustled him out through the bookstore and picked up, I said, you can have any books you want here, just take them, give them to your guys. He picked up books on Christian theology, scholars that he really respected, and said, I invite you to come to Iran to meet with my people. We will not treat you as well as you've treated me here, but this could be a beginning of conversations between our two countries. And it was. It was really very important. I met with the head of their nuclear program for over 2 hours, talking about Augustinian theology, and he was a crackerjack on that. And talking about compassion and bearing the burden of others, and having an environmental sense of what nuclear war would look like. I mean, we're told to be caregivers of the planet. And how can you consider building nuclear weapons and then delivering them by missiles? He looked at me and said, well, you guys do it all the time. I said, that's not a reason for you to do it. But again, I think it's all about relationships. It's like in your churches and your cathedrals. They don't function just because you have great versions, or because you have great priests, because you have a great church school, a beautiful building. People come because they want to be touched, and they want to have conversation, and they want to be heard, and they want to be loved and cared for, and they want to get away from the craziness of politics. They want to begin to talk about the things that really matter. And so being in Iran for 7 shots over the years, I was at the United Nations one day and had lunch with the ambassador from Iran, and he said, John, what are you doing on November 4th? He said, I don't know. He said, well, I do. You're going to be on an airplane. You're going to be flying to Tehran. You can't tell your wife. You can't tell your staff. You can't tell the government. You're going to be going to Iran with 2 Muslims. Your job is to get those 3 hikers released from Evin prison. They've got a 10-year sentence for spying for a foreign power. These were hikers that crossed over from Afghanistan to Iran. So we fly in to Iran for a very testy time, met with members of the nationalists who were like our Senate, our Congress, and we're having this really horrible discussion. It's just awful. Do you know what you did to us? You guys back in the 50s, you and the Brits got rid of our democratically elected president and turned over our government. And I just looked at it and said, I'm here because of the word that your prophet and my Jesus are well known for. And they just stopped. And I said, what is it? I said, it's compassion. It's bearing the burden of others. This is about compassion. This is not about politics. These are kids who made a bad mistake. And if you really follow the teachings of the prophet, and you look for it, or you read our scriptures, bearing the burden of others is the journey. That's what it's all about. Would you like some tea? Again, that conversation, just finding common touchstones in scriptures. Not fly-specking them, but saying, hey, this is how we can get things done. You don't need a politician to do this, although you have to work with them. You have to do it. So, to me, that's where the church has to be. I mean, I'm just an old geezer. I still travel. I still do a lot of work in the Middle East. Some of it is kind of wild. I was in Iraq for 10 days, meeting with religious leaders in that country, pleading for Americans to understand how terrible it is and how broken the country is, and can you do something? Can you go and meet with your government? And or the Episcopal priest who was in Baghdad said, I haven't seen my bishop in 5 years. 5 years. Can you see if you can make that happen for me and my people? Yeah, we can do that. You can't do that, though, unless you get on an airplane and fly over and then deal with the reality that you may never come back, because that was a scary trip. Ford 150 with a 50 caliber machine gun and 3 guys, and one truck in front of us, one behind us, and curtains in the van so people couldn't see us, to go up to Baghdad for these meetings in the green zone with the Prime Minister as well. We couldn't send diplomats to do that, but the church can, because our scriptures are so important for us to understand and to find the common elements, both in the Holy Quran and in the Christian Gospels and in the Old Testament. And that's been a passion of mine, is to do that work. Another question. I don't want to think about the bad kids. Yes.
John, given that premise about the way in which one scripture links to sources from another, help us understand how it is Israel, who begged the world to make a country for them, how they can justify their unwillingness to make that possible for their neighbors.
It's a good point. Actually, if you really study the various interpretations of the Holy Quran and our scriptures, you'll find that the Gospels of Jesus Christ, basically, when you look at the core teaching, are prototypical for the formation of the Holy Quran. In other words, the Prophet Muhammad knew a lot about the early Christians and their movements in that part of the world. He knew a lot about that community. And so a lot of the stuff that you find in the Quran is based on the Gospels of Jesus, which are prototypical. And I worked with a scholar from Princeton on this for about 3 years because it was great ammunition for working. You know what? I worked with Ambassador Katz. I've worked with a lot of people in Israel. Some of them don't like me. It's all about politics. If you can see what's happening in Israel today, it's a very divided country. There are a lot of people that understand your question and would have an answer for it, which would be one that was filled with compassion. But because of the politics, it's not working. And going back to your question, there hasn't been any real effort to sit down at the table in a collective way to have these conversations. Yeah, we can present papers. I go to these conferences and people present papers, and they're wonderful papers, but that's not where it's at. It's people to people. Yeah.
I am from St. Paul's Church in Augusta, Georgia.
Yeah.
And I participated in a very small but effective progressive Christian group there. And one member of that group is a member of a Palestinian family that regularly attends the church. So I've learned what Palestinians are. I've sat next to her when she's crying. They're from Haifa. And she can't believe the news media any better than anybody else here can. Which my question is, do you believe the media does a good enough job of personalizing and humanizing Palestinians, knowing that there is a large and significant population of Palestinian Christians living there and being oppressed right alongside their Muslim?
Absolutely. And you know what? Stephen Hadley was George Bush's, what was he? I guess he ran George's life, the president's life, basically. And I got called in the White House because there was a huge Christian outcry about not allowing Palestinians, right, into the Temple Dome of the Rock for Holy Time celebrating the resurrection of Muhammad. And I can remember the press not really reporting what was going on. And I went into the Roosevelt room, and they had a map laid out on the table. And they said, there's only 2 ways to get in and 2 ways to get out. They're all terrorists anyway. I said, no, they're not. They're good people. They have a right to worship there. Well, the bottom line is, that's not what we see in your press, my press, the American press. does is reporting what is happening. And basically what's happening is because of the Palestinians. They're the problem. They're the problem. And for anybody who spent time in Palestine and spent time with folks there, the Christian community is very, very strong. Small, but very, very strong. I don't know how they survive. I don't know how their hospitals survive, but they do. I don't know what to say other than I don't think the press is there to make money. You know, you write a story, you want people to read the paper, or whatever it is on the internet. The stuff that goes on is not covered well. And it's basically, and also the press tends to be tilted toward where an administration might be here in this country, which is true. When we were dealing with the Iraqi war, the Washington Post finally agreed to meet with 5 Christian leaders in the district and outside the district. They said that they were pressured by the United States government to make sure that stories that were not so directly related to finding another way were run in the newspaper. Now that sounds scary, but that is in fact true. And that came from the editor at that time of the Washington Post saying the pressure to tell the story in a way that supports American foreign policy is very important globally. And Israel is a part of it, and always will be a part of it. Palestine is a failed state. Not a helpful answer. Yes?
Melita Thorpe from St. John's, Laurel, Mississippi. What caused the Oslo Accord to fail?
I remember when that was in preparation, and you really want an honest answer? Politics. That's it. Where are we in the process? Self-interest often plays out in politics, and I kind of understand that, having served on the House of Bishops for a while. But I have to say that was heartbreaking, but it was not something that was surprising for me, but it was heartbreaking. And I don't know how you felt about it, but I mean, what was your perception?
Extremely disappointing. A lot of work went into it, and President Clinton was supporting it all the way. I mean, it was first organized behind the scenes, and then it grew larger. It looked like it was going to work, and then it fell apart.
Again, it was the other states involved in it, and their needs to be met.
I'm David Crossan from St. Mary the Virgin in San Francisco. The Episcopal, one of the groups I've been working with the Episcopal Church is Episcopal Migration Ministries. We're just doing astounding work, and I assume we have some impact on work in San Diego since that crisis is so evident. What I'm wondering is, we have a lot of people in our congregation, I suspect in no other congregation, that say we can't get involved, churches can't get involved in politics. We can't do that sort of work, when in fact, we have, and then I tell them, but we have we have an office in Washington, D.C. that lobbies, for Lord's sake.
Well, we don't really lobby.
Yeah, okay. So would you talk about that, please?
Yeah. Politics is from, I never like to read backwards, so I didn't do well in Greek. Polis, and it means the governance of the city or the governance of a community. That's what politics translates out to be from its classical roots. And you can't govern a city without a set of moral codes and values, which are part of the life of that community. There's always going to be people who will look at you and say, oh, we can't go there because you can't mix politics and religion. I keep reading the gospel and I can't find Jesus running away from that one. I mean, really. So, but it's a fearful thing. I mean, I had to deal with that in the House of Bishops for a long time. And I was considered to be far too liberal and was threatened with censure, along with some of my other brothers and sisters. There's a great book it's called, I don't know if you can find it, it's a book about John Hines. It's called Granite on Fire. If you can find that book and read it, that is one of the greatest books I've ever read about what I would call the contemporary Episcopal Church that deals exactly with that issue. It's all about John Hines as the presiding bishop, who was elected because he was a Southerner, but he also was a great pastor, a great teacher, and a great compassionate soul. And John was the one who said, the hell with that. It's about people. It's about people. And sometimes politics and religion will find themselves not being partnered or don't want to be partnered. But the bottom line is theologies are more powerful than the state. And you, John, should know that if you read the Gospels and about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Now, Jesus was crucified for it. You and I don't have to be crucified for it, but we have to follow the example of somebody who gave his life for others. And we have a lot of saints in our church who did that, by the way. You gotta have more questions? No? No? Let me close with this, if I can. I was in Iran on a trip, and I was leaving I was going to fly home. I wanted to bring some souvenirs to my kids and Karen. They do great metalware and enamelware, stuff like that. And my driver was from the foreign ministry. He said, oh, I know a souk down the road where I can negotiate price. And so we go in, and I am dressed up in my bishop thing and my pectoral cross. And says, no, there's no misunderstanding of who I am. I'm a Christian. Go in, get the stuff. We're going back to the limousine to take me to the airport. And this woman comes running down the sidewalk screaming in Farsi with two younger women. And I said to the driver, let's get out of here now. I don't want any more anti-American stuff today. I want to go home and see my family. He said, no. He said, they want you to bless them. They're Christians. And this is in the middle of Tehran at 5 o'clock at night, which is chaos. It's like being in Egypt or anywhere where you've got millions of people living. And they came running up, and the older woman knelt down on the sidewalk, was not speaking any English. And I said to the driver, I don't speak Farsi. He said, it doesn't matter. Just speak your words from your scripture. Lay hands on her head, and it'll be fine. And I said, you got all these people driving, it's a crime in your country to cross the lines. He said, no, it isn't. And then he said, the other two came up, and they were younger. They were her daughters. And they asked to be blessed. In the middle of 5 o'clock rush hour traffic, driving by. And then they got up, and they were all weeping. And they bowed, and they went down the sidewalk. And he said to me, the driver. You know, we worship the same God. You have your Jesus. We have Muhammad, but we have the same God. There is no crime in the world that can beat that. Now let's go to the airport. Thank you very, very much. Brooks Mason, thank you very much. And Dean Penny, if she's not here, she's a great dean. And when you look around this cathedral and you see what it does in its ministry, you know, I think that you, Dean Penny, and also Seattle and so many other cathedrals, I know you're all linked together, but this is really an exciting place to worship, to be a part of, and to see change happen in this very, very diverse city. So thank you both.